For 9 straight years, Samsung has outsold Apple in smartphones almost every single quarter. It builds more phones, sells them in more countries, and its flagship hardware routinely beats the iPhone on paper. Better screens, faster charging, folding glass that Apple still hasn't shipped. And yet, ask a teenager in Los Angeles, London, or Lagos, which phone is cool, and the answer comes back instantly. It's not Samsung. It's the one with the little glowing fruit on the back. This is the strangest imbalance in modern consumer technology. The company that wins on specs, on volume, on innovation velocity, loses on the one metric that actually prints money over time: desire. But something is shifting, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why the next 3 years could finally close that gap, or prove it's unclosable. Before we go further, let's be precise about what we're actually measuring, because cool sounds like a soft, unserious word for a hard business problem. It isn't. What we're really talking about is brand equity, the premium a company can charge, the loyalty it can bank on, the free marketing it gets when people show off a product unprompted. Apple's brand is consistently ranked among the 2 or 3 most valuable in the world by Interbrand and Kantar brands, worth several $100 billion as a standalone asset, separate from its factories, its patents, or its cash reserves. Samsung, despite being a bigger company by revenue when you include semiconductors, appliances, and displays, sits well behind it in brand value rankings, usually in the 5 to 7 range globally, respected but not beloved in the same way. This isn't a marketing footnote. It's the reason Apple can charge $900 to $1,200 for a phone built with components that, when torn down and priced individually, often cost less than the equivalent Samsung device. It's the reason Apple's iPhone alone generates more profit than nearly every other smartphone maker on Earth combined, despite Samsung shipping more units. Counterpoint research and Canalys data has shown this pattern for years. Apple captures a share of global smartphone profit that is wildly disproportionate to its unit market share, sometimes exceeding 60% of the industry's entire profit pool from a device lineup that represents under 20% of units sold. That gap is the cool factor, monetized. So when we ask whether Samsung can close it, we're not asking a vanity question. We're asking whether one of the largest industrial conglomerates on the planet can crack a code that has eluded it for nearly 2 decades. To understand whether Samsung can catch up, we need to understand how Apple built this moat, because it wasn't inevitable, and it wasn't just good advertising. It was a specific sequence of choices that compounded over 20 years. The first ingredient was scarcity through control. Apple makes a small number of products. In any given year, you can count the current iPhone lineup on one hand. Compare that to Samsung, which historically sold dozens of phone models simultaneously across different regions and price points. The Galaxy S line, the A series, the M series, the Z series, region-specific variants, carrier-specific variants. From a pure market coverage standpoint, this made sense. Samsung wanted a phone for every budget and every buyer. But it also diluted the brand. When you own an iPhone, you own one of maybe 4 current models. When you own a Samsung, you might own one of 30. Scarcity creates status. Abundance creates commodity. Apple understood this instinctively, going back to Steve Jobs' famous decision in 1997 to slash Apple's product line down to 4 core products on a simple grid. Samsung, as a Korean industrial conglomerate built on a philosophy of market saturation across every price tier, structurally resisted that kind of discipline for years. The second ingredient was closed ecosystem lock-in, engineered specifically to make switching painful and staying delightful. iMessage is the cleanest example. In the United States in particular, the blue bubble versus green bubble divide has become a genuine social signal, especially among teenagers and young adults. Surveys from Piper Sandler's biannual teen survey have shown iPhone ownership among U.S. teens sitting north of 80% for years, and a meaningful chunk of that isn't about camera quality or chip speed. It's about not being the green bubble in the group chat, not having your videos compress into potato quality when you send them to friends, not being the one person whose AirDrop doesn't work at the lunch table. Apple built a system where the cost of leaving isn't just, I have to learn new software. It's, I lose access to a shared social language. That is an extraordinarily durable form of lock-in, and it's almost entirely a software and social decision, not a hardware one. The third ingredient was design restraint as identity. Apple's industrial design language, flat planes, minimal ports, a consistent visual grammar across the iPhone, MacBook, iPad, and Apple Watch created what design theorists call a family resemblance. You can spot an Apple product across a room without seeing a logo. Samsung's design across its portfolio has historically been more fragmented, partly because it serves so many price tiers, and partly because, as a component supplier to half the electronics industry, including Apple itself, it has had less incentive to make every product a coherent brand statement rather than an engineering showcase. The fourth ingredient, and probably the most underrated one, was retail as theater. Apple stores were never really stores in the traditional sense. They were built, deliberately, as temples. Glass facades, wide-open floor plans, product displayed like sculpture, staff trained to talk about feelings and creativity rather than gigahertz and megapixels. Ron Johnson, who designed the original Apple Store concept alongside Jobs, has spoken about modeling the experience on hospitality, not electronics retail. Samsung Experience stores exist and have expanded significantly, but they arrived roughly a decade later and are still, in most markets, secondary to the Apple Store as a cultural landmark. Put those four ingredients together: scarcity, lock-in, design coherence, and retail theater, and you get a brand that doesn't just sell phones, it sells belonging. Now, it would be a mistake to frame this as Samsung being a lesser company. In almost every hard engineering category, Samsung either matches or beats Apple and has for years. Start with displays. Samsung Display is the dominant supplier of OLED panels to the entire industry, including notably to Apple itself for iPhone screens. When you buy an iPhone with an OLED display, there's a very real chance the panel inside it was manufactured by Samsung. This is worth sitting with for a second. Samsung is quite literally building parts of its biggest rival's most desirable product. That's not a company behind on technology. That's a company so far ahead on core display science that its competitor has no choice but to buy from it. Then there's foldables. Samsung has now shipped 6 generations of the Galaxy Z Fold and Z Flip lines, iterating on hinge durability, crease reduction, weight, and price. Apple, as of today, has never shipped a folding device, and industry reporting, including from generally reliable Apple supply chain analysts, has suggested a foldable iPhone likely won't arrive before 2026 at the very earliest, and possibly later. That means Samsung will have had roughly 6 or 7 years of real-world iteration, manufacturing learning, and consumer feedback before Apple ships its first attempt. In hardware terms, that is an enormous head start. Charging speed is another category where the gap is almost embarrassing for Apple. Samsung flagships have supported 45-watt wired charging for several generations, alongside fast wireless charging. Apple's iPhones, even in their most recent flagship generations, have remained capped at wired charging speeds meaningfully below that, a decision widely understood to be about battery longevity and thermal management rather than an inability to go faster, but from a pure consumer-facing spec sheet it reads as Apple simply being behind. Samsung's camera systems, particularly on the Ultra tier of its S-series, frequently lead or tie DxOMark's camera rankings, especially in zoom performance, where Samsung's periscope telephoto lenses have offered significantly longer optical reach than anything Apple has shipped. And there's customization. Samsung phones, running Android with Samsung's One UI layered on top, allow for a level of home screen customization, default app switching, and system-level tweaking that iOS still restricts, even after Apple's gradual loosening of some rules in recent years under regulatory pressure, particularly in the European Union under the Digital Markets Act. So the honest picture is this: Samsung is not behind on innovation, it is behind on desire. And those are very different problems requiring very different solutions. If there is one category where Samsung has a genuine structural opportunity to become the cooler brand rather than just the more capable one, it's foldables, and specifically, it's what happens when Apple finally enters that category. Here's the strategic logic. Right now, foldables are still a relatively niche category globally, representing a low single-digit percentage of total smartphone shipments, according to Counterpoint and IDC tracking. But they are growing quickly and critically. They are one of the only genuinely new form factors the smartphone industry has produced in over a decade. Everything else, camera bumps, slightly bigger screens, faster chips, is incremental. A phone that unfolds into a tablet, or a phone that folds down to fit in a coin pocket like the Flip line, is not incremental. It's a new physical relationship between a human being and a device, and new physical relationships are exactly the kind of thing that generate genuine cultural buzz rather than manufactured hype. Samsung has spent 7 generations quietly working out the kinks, the crease, the hinge durability, the software adaptation for split screen and flex mode use, the weight distribution, the price. By most industry estimates, foldable durability and cost have improved dramatically since the original Galaxy Fold's disastrous and embarrassing 2019 launch, when review units famously broke within days due to screen protector and hinge debris issues. That failure could have killed the category for Samsung. Instead, the company kept iterating, and by the Z Fold 6 and Z Flip 6 generation, reviewers broadly treated foldables as a mature, if still premium-priced product category rather than an experimental one. Now consider what happens the moment Apple ships its own foldable. Again, something analysts widely expect sometime in 2026 or later, based on supply chain reporting. The instant Apple validates the category by entering it, mainstream consumer attention and media coverage around foldables will spike enormously, the way it always does when Apple enters an existing category rather than inventing one. Think of how the smartwatch category exploded in cultural relevance only after the Apple Watch launched in 2015, years after Pebble and early Android Wear devices had already established the concept. Samsung has a choice to make right now about how it positions itself for that moment. If it plays it right, leaning hard into "we've been perfecting this for years while Apple is just arriving," it has a rare opportunity to be positioned as the innovator and the incumbent in a category that's about to get a massive cultural spotlight, rather than being cast, yet again, as the fast follower playing catch-up. That is close to the only realistic scenario where Samsung becomes the trendsetter and Apple becomes the copier in the public imagination, even temporarily. The second front where the balance of desirability could shift is artificial intelligence, and this one is messier and less predictable for both companies. Apple's approach, branded Apple Intelligence, launched later than many competitors and was, by Apple's own public acknowledgement, delayed in rolling out its more ambitious features, including a more conversational, personalized version of Siri that was originally previewed but then pushed back, with Apple confirming in 2026 that some of the more advanced Siri capabilities had slipped further than originally planned. For a company whose entire brand is built on shipping things that feel finished and magical rather than half-built, this stumble matters more than it would for almost any competitor. Cool is partly about confidence, and a visibly delayed, visibly underwhelming AI rollout dents that confidence in a way that's unusual for Apple. Samsung, meanwhile, partnered aggressively with Google, integrating Gemini deeply into Galaxy AI features across live translation, photo editing, and search-based visual queries, and pushed hard to be first to market with generative AI features baked into a mainstream flagship line rather than an experimental add-on. The Galaxy S24 and S25 generations leaned heavily into this Galaxy AI branding as a headline selling point, arguably the most aggressive AI as marketing push of any phone maker to date. But here's the complication. Being first with AI features hasn't automatically translated into being perceived as cooler. AI features, unlike a folding screen or a striking industrial design, are largely invisible in a social setting. Nobody looks cool pulling out their phone to use a live translation feature at a dinner party the way they might look cool unfolding a tablet-sized screen from their pocket. AI utility is real, and it may genuinely influence purchase decisions for practical buyers, but it doesn't carry the same social signaling weight that hardware form factor or brand ecosystem does. So while Samsung may currently have a lead in AI feature deployment, it's not obvious that lead converts into the kind of desire we're actually measuring in this video. It might matter more for retention and satisfaction than for aspirational brand pull. Here is the uncomfortable truth for Samsung, and it's the biggest structural obstacle standing between the company and genuine cool status. Ecosystem lock-in is not primarily a hardware problem, and Samsung does not fully control the software layer the way Apple does. Samsung phones run Android, an operating system owned and ultimately governed by Google. Samsung can skin it, add features on top, and negotiate default placement for its own apps, but it cannot unilaterally decide how iMessage-style exclusivity works, because Google's own messaging strategy has historically been fragmented and inconsistent, jumping between Google Talk, Hangouts, Allo, Duo, and now RCS-based Google Messages, a level of product churn that has made it very difficult for any single green bubble equivalent of social cachet to form around the Android ecosystem the way it has around iMessage. Similarly, Samsung's cross-device ecosystem, SmartThings for home devices, Samsung Health, Galaxy Watch, Galaxy Buds, is genuinely well built at a technical level, and reviewers regularly praise how smoothly a Galaxy phone, watch, and earbuds work together. But it competes against an Apple ecosystem that includes not just the iPhone and Apple Watch, but the Mac, iPad, AirPods, and increasingly the car through CarPlay, all bound together by iCloud, handoff, and continuity features that let you start an email on your iPhone and finish it on your Mac without thinking about it. The average premium consumer, especially in the United States, is more likely to already own a Mac or be a CarPlay user than to already own a Samsung tablet, and that pre-existing footprint compounds. Ecosystems don't just add value linearly, they add value exponentially, because every additional device you own inside one ecosystem makes leaving that ecosystem more expensive in time, money, and hassle. Apple built that exponential curve over 2 decades across 5 product categories. Samsung is still building it in real time, and it's building it inside an Android environment it doesn't fully control end-to-end. Despite everything above, there's a demographic trend working genuinely in Samsung's favor that's worth taking seriously, rather than dismissing as wishful thinking from Samsung's marketing department. Global smartphone growth has shifted heavily toward markets like India, Southeast Asia, and parts of Africa and Latin America, where price sensitivity is real and where Apple's premium pricing puts it structurally out of reach for a much larger share of first-time and second-time smartphone buyers than in the United States or Western Europe. In India specifically, one of the largest and fastest-growing smartphone markets on Earth, Samsung and Chinese manufacturers like Xiaomi, Vivo, and Oppo have historically dominated unit volume, while Apple, despite growing quickly off a small base and pushing hard with local manufacturing to reduce import costs, still represents a minority share of the overall market. As these markets mature and as a new generation of consumers in those regions forms their brand loyalty for the first time, Samsung has a real chance to be the aspirational brand in a way it structurally cannot be in the US teen market Piper Sandler tracks. Cool is not a universal, fixed concept. It is regionally constructed, and Samsung's regional strength in the largest population centers on the planet is not nothing. It might, over a 10 or 15-year horizon, matter more than winning over American teenagers ever could. Let's get concrete about where this actually goes. Based on everything laid out above, there are 3 plausible paths forward, and each one has real evidence behind it. The first is what we might call the foldable flip. Apple ships its first foldable device sometime around 2026 or 2027, and the launch becomes a massive cultural moment the way the original iPhone and Apple Watch launches were. But because Samsung has spent 7+ years perfecting hinge durability, crease reduction, and software multitasking on folding screens, early reviews and comparisons favor Samsung's version as the more refined, more mature product, even against Apple's marketing muscle. In this scenario, foldables become the first category in the smartphone era where Samsung is broadly perceived, at least temporarily, as the innovator and Apple as the fast follower. This doesn't flip the entire cool equation overnight, but it cracks it in a category that gets outsized media attention, and it gives Samsung its first genuine claim to cultural leadership in a decade. The second is the ecosystem stalemate. Neither company meaningfully closes the gap, because the core issue was never really about specs, AI features, or even foldables. It was always about ecosystem lock-in and social signaling, particularly around messaging in the US market. Apple continues resisting full RCS equivalent parity with iMessage in any way that would erode the blue bubble distinction. Regulatory pressure in the EU forces some interoperability changes in Europe but doesn't meaningfully shift US teen and young adult social dynamics, and Samsung remains the technically superior but culturally secondary choice in North America and Western Europe indefinitely, even as it continues dominating unit sales globally and expanding its lead in emerging markets. Under this scenario, the brand gap doesn't close, it just becomes permanently regionalized, with Samsung effectively cool in Seoul, Delhi, and São Paulo, and Apple remaining dominant in the cultural sense across the US, UK, and much of Western Europe. The third, and this is the wild card, is the AI reset. This is the scenario that could restructure the entire competitive landscape, rather than just nudging it. If generative AI assistants become genuinely central to how people use their phones, not just a feature, but the primary interface, replacing a meaningful share of app tapping with conversational commands, then whichever company has the best underlying AI model, not the best hardware or the most elegant retail stores, could reset the brand hierarchy from scratch. In this world, Apple's historical advantages in industrial design and ecosystem lock-in matter less, because the interface layer changes entirely, and both Apple and Samsung become somewhat dependent on their AI partners, Apple reportedly exploring deeper partnerships including with Google's Gemini for certain Apple Intelligence features, and Samsung already deeply integrated with Gemini. In this scenario, the real winner of the cool war over the next decade might not be Samsung or Apple at all, but whichever AI company, Google, OpenAI, or another player, ends up owning the assistant layer that both hardware makers are forced to license. Here's my honest read after laying all of that out. Samsung is not going to outcool Apple in the United States within the next 3 years. The ecosystem lock-in is too deep, the social signaling around iMessage is too entrenched among the exact demographic that sets cultural trends, and Apple's 20-year head start on retail experience and design coherence isn't something you close with a better spec sheet or a smarter AI feature. If you're betting on the American teenager suddenly deciding green bubbles are cool, I would not take that bet. But I think the frame of the question itself, can Samsung outcool Apple, is actually the wrong frame for measuring who wins the next decade of this rivalry. And that's the thing I want you to walk away from this video actually thinking about. Cool, in the way we've been discussing it, is a lagging indicator. It's the residue of decisions made 5, 10, 15 years ago about ecosystems and retail and design. The leading indicators, the things that will actually determine who has pricing power and cultural relevance in 2035, are foldables, where Samsung has a genuine multi-year head start the moment Apple validates the category, and artificial intelligence, where the entire industry's assumptions about brand loyalty could get scrambled if the assistant layer becomes more important than the hardware it runs on. Samsung's best move isn't chasing Apple's version of cool. It's making foldables and AI-native computing so good, so fast, that by the time Apple's ecosystem lock-in would normally kick in and protect its dominance, the category itself has moved somewhere Apple hasn't fully arrived yet. That's not outmaneuvering Apple's cool factor in the traditional sense. That's making the entire concept of cool, as we've understood it for the last 15 years, obsolete before Apple gets to defend it. We'll be watching Apple's foldable launch closely when it comes, because that single event is probably the best real-time test we're going to get of everything discussed in this video. If you want to see how this plays out as it happens, subscribe and turn on notifications, because when that launch date is confirmed, we'll be breaking it down in real time.